The world is being redrawn right now, and most people are only seeing one piece of the puzzle. What you're about to hear is about the full picture, the one that matters, the one that directly affects the balance of power that determines your future, your economy, and the wars your country may or may not fight next. We're talking about Turkey, we're talking about Russia, we're talking about Israel, and we're talking about a strategic air corridor that has quietly become one of the most consequential fault lines in modern geopolitics. Because here is the thing that the mainstream narrative keeps missing. The moves being made in the skies above the Middle East and Eurasia are not accidents. They are calculated, they are deliberate, and they are reshaping alliances, trade routes, and military reach in ways that no one in Washington seems willing to talk about honestly, so let's talk about it. Let's trace exactly what is happening, why it's happening, and what it means for you, for America, and for a world that is undergoing a fundamental realignment, the likes of which we have not seen since the Cold War ended. Let's start with Turkey. Because Turkey is the linchpin of everything we're discussing here. Turkey is simultaneously a NATO member maintaining open Western corridors, a regional power asserting airspace sovereignty, and a commercial aviation juggernaut turning crisis into opportunity. That sentence alone should stop you in your tracks, because that is not a description of a loyal American ally. That is a description of a sovereign actor playing all sides of a geopolitical chessboard with extraordinary skill and patience. And Erdogan has been doing this for years, positioning Turkey as the indispensable bridge between East and West, between NATO and Russia, between the Atlantic world and the emerging multipolar order that is being constructed piece by piece as we speak. Now, let's get specific about what Turkey has been doing with its airspace and why it matters so much. Turkey's bilateral trade with Russia reached about $52.6 billion in 2024, with the goal of raising bilateral trade volume to $100 billion under a new roadmap agreement. Russian gas supplies via Turkstream and Bluestream continue to underpin Turkey's energy security, with pipeline deliveries up year on year. Think about that number for a moment. $52 billion in bilateral trade with a country that America has sanctioned, that NATO has called an aggressor, that the entire Western financial architecture has tried to isolate. And Turkey just keeps trading, keeps talking, keeps building pipelines, keeps maintaining relationships. This is not recklessness. This is strategy, and Turkey has not been shy about using its position as a geographic choke point to project influence in multiple directions at once. Turkey uses its strategic location as a transit country to connect European markets with suppliers in the Middle East, Central Asia, and Russia. Infrastructure projects like Turkstream, the Southern Gas Corridor, and the Iraq-Turkey Oil Corridor have an impact on Eurasian geopolitics. When you control the pipelines and the corridors, you control the conversation. You get a seat at every table, you get leverage over every party, and that is precisely where Ankara finds itself today, holding leverage over Moscow, over Brussels, over Washington, and over Tel Aviv simultaneously. That is a remarkable position for a country of 85 million people to occupy, and it did not happen by accident. Now let's bring Israel into this picture, because the Israel angle of this story is where things get genuinely alarming and genuinely clarifying at the same time. After the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria was wiped away by a Turkish-backed rebel offensive, it has been replaced by a weak Islamist regime under Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Israel has understandably been alarmed by this development and has moved in force to create a buffer zone to protect the Golan Heights. Taking control over territory in Syria has had a second benefit for Israel. It allows the Israeli Air Force to better enhance their otherwise limited ability to reach Iran with airstrikes. The area that Israel has co-opted in Syria is now part of their air corridor, linking Israeli territory with that of Iran, cutting across Syria and northern Iraq into neighboring Iran. So this is the crux of it. Israel has been building and protecting an air corridor through Syria and Iraq, a corridor it needs to project military power all the way to Iran. Without that corridor, striking Iran becomes exponentially harder. With that corridor, Israel gains the ability to launch fifth-generation stealth aircraft deep into Iranian territory. And this is not theoretical. Last October, the Israelis used this air corridor to launch airstrikes with their F-35I Adir fifth-generation warplanes against targets in Iran. According to Israeli sources, they destroyed a handful of powerful Russian-made S-300 air defense systems, leaving Iran exposed to future Israeli attacks. That corridor was the decisive factor, and Turkey knows it. Because here is what Turkey did next. And this is the move that changes everything. Turkey is moving powerful anti-aircraft systems into Syria. Among those systems deployed are the S-400 Triumph, the Hisar A and Hisar O+, and the Korkut air defense systems. Turkey is reportedly enhancing these deployments with advanced radar networks to monitor Syrian airspace extensively, potentially covering areas as far as Damascus. Now pause and let that sink in fully. Turkey, a NATO member, a country that buys American F-16s, a country with troops at NATO bases across Europe, has deployed Russian-built S-400 systems into Syria in positions that directly threaten the air corridor Israel has been using to strike Iran. This is not a small thing. This is a direct military challenge to Israel's freedom of action in the region, and it is being executed by a country that formally remains in the NATO alliance. The Israelis understood immediately what was happening. Sensing the inherent threat posed to its war planning against Iran by Turkey's move, the Israeli Air Force conducted devastating airstrikes on April 2nd, targeting military sites in Syria, such as those near Palmyra, Hama, and Damascus, in a bid to degrade the capacity of these former army bases to host the Turks and their advanced air defense systems. So Israel struck positions that Turkey was moving into. That is, Israeli jets hitting Turkish military assets inside Syria. And according to unconfirmed reports at the time, Turkish military officers were killed in those strikes. Let the full weight of that geopolitical fact register. NATO, Turkey, and Israel, supposedly aligned states, supposedly partners in the American-centered security order, were effectively exchanging military blows through the territory of a third country. And then, Turkey escalated further on the diplomatic and economic front. Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan confirmed that Ankara had taken the dramatic step of severing all trade relations and closing its airspace to Israeli aircraft, with Fidan declaring that Israel's military actions across the Middle East represent the clearest sign of a terrorist state mentality. The foreign minister of a NATO country called Israel a terrorist state. That is not rhetoric, that is a formal diplomatic positioning that has real consequences for the entire architecture of Middle Eastern geopolitics. And Turkey backed it up with concrete action. Turkey has cut all trade with Israel, does not allow Turkish ships to go to Israeli ports, and has closed its airspace to Israeli aircraft. Now think about what this means in practice for Israel. Detours caused by the closed airspace could increase the travel time of flights from Israel to countries such as Georgia and Azerbaijan by almost 2 hours. That sounds minor when you describe it in terms of passenger flights. But when you think about it in terms of military logistics, intelligence flights, and the flow of diplomatic personnel and strategic cargo, those 2 hours represent a fundamental change in Israel's strategic geography. Turkey's airspace closure is a slow stranglehold. It does not stop Israel overnight, but it narrows Israel's options, adds costs to every operation, and signals to every other regional actor that the era of Israel operating with impunity across the Middle Eastern sky may be coming to an end. And where does Russia fit into all of this? This is where the strategic air corridor story gets its deepest dimension, because Russia and Turkey have been quietly constructing a relationship that defies simple categorization. A relationship built not on ideology or alliance, but on mutual interest, pragmatic necessity, and the shared recognition that the post-Cold War American-dominated order is fracturing. Energy relations between Russia and Turkey have shifted beyond the traditional supplier-consumer framework. They are now positioned at a fragile threshold where geopolitical balancing and commercial pragmatism increasingly intersect. Europe's post-Ukraine war disengagement from Russian gas has pushed Moscow to rely more heavily on a limited number of large, infrastructure-rich markets, such as Turkey. So Russia needs Turkey. And Turkey knows it needs Russia even as it diversifies. Russia continues to be Turkey's largest single supplier, with roughly 15 to 18 billion cubic meters of gas annually from Russia. Yet this trade no longer represents a one-sided dependency. Instead, Russian gas has become a commercially and geopolitically managed component within Turkey's increasingly diversified energy portfolio. This is the genius of Erdogan's position. He has structured the Russia-Turkey relationship so that Russia needs the relationship more than Turkey does, which gives Ankara enormous leverage. Leverage it has used to extract concessions, to position itself as a peace broker in Ukraine, and to quietly build a strategic depth that no purely Western-aligned country could achieve. The air corridor that Turkey has effectively opened to Russia, through Turkstream, through trade relationships, through the implicit understanding that Ankara will not fully implement Western sanctions, is not just a physical corridor, it is a political corridor. It is an acknowledgement that Moscow and Ankara have found a mode of coexistence that benefits both parties, even as they technically back different sides in various regional conflicts. Turkey has positioned itself as a mediator between Moscow and Kyiv, though Ankara's role is more constrained compared to 2022, given US leadership in the negotiation process. While still important, Turkey's diplomatic role is more as a facilitator than a full mediator. But even a facilitator in a war between nuclear powers is not a small thing. Even a facilitator gets to write some of the terms. Even a facilitator extracts a price for its services, and while all of this has been unfolding between Turkey and Russia, the broader regional war has been escalating dramatically. On 28 February 2026, Israel and the United States launched attacks on targets across Iran, codenamed Operation Roaring Lion in Israel and Operation Epic Fury in the United States. This is the moment that transformed everything from a slow-building geopolitical drama into an active regional war. The strikes on Iran that had been building through the June 2025 conflict and the accumulation of pressure over Iran's nuclear program finally broke into open warfare, and the consequences for the Turkey-Russia-Israel triangle immediately became acute. On 4 March 2026, NATO air and missile defense installations in Turkey and the eastern Mediterranean intercepted a ballistic missile that was bound for Turkey after the missile was detected passing through Iraqi and Syrian airspace. Following the incident, Turkish officials remarked that the missile was launched from Iran. Turkey then asserted her right to retaliate. The Iranian ambassador in Ankara was shortly after summoned to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So here is Turkey simultaneously condemning Israel as a terrorist state, maintaining energy and trade ties with Russia, and now being hit by Iranian missiles that pass through the airspace of the same Syria where Turkish troops are deployed. This is the complexity of the situation that Western mainstream media consistently fails to capture, because it does not fit neatly into the good guys and bad guys framework that American audiences are fed. On March 30th, the Defense Ministry said that for the fourth time, NATO air defense systems intercepted an Iranian missile that entered Turkey's airspace. Ankara sent a protest and warning to Tehran, saying all necessary measures were being taken decisively and without hesitation against any threat directed at Turkey's territory and airspace. Think about the position Turkey is in. It has closed its airspace to Israel, it has maintained warm relations with Russia, and now Iran, which Turkey had been relatively sympathetic toward in the context of the Gaza conflict, is firing missiles that are passing through or near Turkish territory. Erdogan is navigating a minefield of contradictions, and so far he has not stepped on any of them fatally, but the pressure is immense. The deeper truth here, and this is the truth that the established power structures in Washington and Brussels do not want you to sit with too long, is that the air corridors of this region are not just flight paths. They are expressions of sovereignty, of alliance, of moral and political positioning. When Turkey closes its airspace to Israel, it is making a statement about international law and genocide that the United States government has consistently refused to make. When Turkey keeps its energy corridors open to Russia despite Western pressure, it is making a statement about sovereignty and economic self-interest that challenges the entire premise of the sanctions regime. And when Turkey deploys Russian-built S-400 systems into Syria in positions that threaten Israeli air operations, it is making a statement about whose security matters in this region and who gets to define the rules of the sky. From Ankara's perspective, three actors, each beginning with the letter I, actively undermine Syria's new government: ISIS, Iran, and Israel. Of these, according to Turkey, Israel poses the gravest threat to Syrian stability. Israel has become the principal external destabilizing military actor in Syria. In the first 7 months following Assad's fall, Israel conducted 988 air and artillery strikes, nearly triple the 334 airstrikes carried out over the previous 7 years. When a NATO member makes that kind of formal assessment, that Israel, not Iran, is the primary destabilizing force in a critical Arab country, you are witnessing a fundamental crack in the architecture of the American-led regional security order. This is not a small disagreement. This is a collision of visions about what the Middle East is for, who gets to shape it, and what moral framework governs the use of military force. Israeli analysts have characterized Ankara's ambitions as posing a threat to security interests, including freedom of movement in important air corridors. This comes amid a growing campaign by Israeli politicians and the media to portray Turkey as the next Iran. That framing, Turkey as the next Iran, tells you everything about how panicked certain circles in Jerusalem are about what Erdogan has been building, because Iran, for all its power, has been isolated, sanctioned, and surrounded. Turkey is a NATO member with the second largest military in the alliance, with advanced domestic weapon systems, with S-400s purchased from Russia, with a growing defense export industry, with strategic relationships in all directions. Turkey cannot be isolated the way Iran was isolated. Turkey cannot be sanctioned the way Iran was sanctioned. And Turkey has now made clear that it considers Israeli military operations in Syria to be a direct threat to Turkish national security. The strategic logic of what Turkey has done becomes clear when you step back far enough to see the whole board. Whoever controls the routes determines the rules of the trade. And in this game, Turkey clearly wants to be an architect, not a transit country. That sentence captures Erdogan's entire foreign policy vision in 12 words. Turkey does not want to be the road that others drive on. Turkey wants to design the road network, collect the tolls, and decide who gets access. And right now, through the opening of strategic corridors to Russia, the closing of airspace to Israel, and the deployment of advanced air defense systems into Syria, Turkey is asserting exactly that kind of architectural role in the reshaping of Eurasian and Middle Eastern geopolitics. What does all of this mean for the United States? It means that the post-Cold War assumption that Turkey was a reliable NATO flank anchor, that the Middle Eastern sky was essentially American and Israeli airspace, that Russia could be isolated through sanctions and Western unity, that assumption is dead. It did not die suddenly. It died slowly through 1,000 transactional decisions in Ankara, through Erdogan's calculation that Turkey's interests were better served by sovereign flexibility than by unconditional Western alignment, through the failure of Washington to offer Turkey the kind of partnership that would have locked it more firmly into the Western orbit. Turkey is simultaneously a NATO member maintaining open Western corridors, a regional power asserting airspace sovereignty, and a commercial aviation juggernaut turning crisis into opportunity. And America, for all its power, has no clean answer to that equation, because you cannot sanction a NATO ally, you cannot bomb a country that hosts American nuclear weapons, and you cannot ignore a country that controls the Bosphorus, the Turk Stream pipeline, and the airspace above the most contested geography on Earth. The world you thought you understood, where America set the rules of the sky, where Israel operated freely across the Middle East, where Russia was boxed in by Western sanctions, where Turkey was a loyal ally pointing east, that world is gone. What is replacing it is messier, more multipolar, more honest about power and interest, and less covered in the language of values and democracy. And the air corridor between Turkey and Russia, the one that is staying open even as the corridor to Israel gets shut, is one of the clearest signs of that replacement. The architecture of the new world is being built in the skies, and the question for America is whether it is even paying attention.